Well, Lynn alluded to it already this morning, but for those of you who haven't been here in a couple of weeks, you have been a little surprised when you walked in and saw my tent, and a hammock, and some of these other camping-themed things up here. It's summer. It makes me always think of camping this time of year, or maybe it's already getting a little hot for camping. I'm really grateful I wasn't in a tent last night. Hope none of you were. But we've been doing a sermon series for the past few weeks now during the month of June that I've been calling Laws of the Woods. And the Laws of the Woods are the name given to the little things that were really observations on the part of my father and I as we would take father-son camping trips growing up. Every summer, my dad and I and my uncle and my cousin, we'd get in a car, we'd load up a couple of canoes on the top, and we'd drive up to the northern Minnesota wilderness called the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, and we would spend a week camping together. Some of the observations that we picked up on that we brought up the first 2 weeks of the sermon series, the first one was sometimes you've got to get your boots wet. In other words, that's a law of the woods, meaning that sometimes in order to preserve the canoe from tipping over when you're trying to beach it up on the land, it's going to take the guy in the front of the canoe to get out, get his feet wet, and pull the boat ashore so that you're not trying to teeter your way up onto the shore and risk tipping over the whole canoe and losing all of your gear and the back passenger. The next law of the woods we talked about last week was that no matter where you sit on the campfire, the smoke will find you and it will sting your eyes. And if you move a few feet to the right or left, it's going to find you there too. Eventually the smoke will always find you. And we talked about how Jesus talks about persistence in prayer and how that really makes an important difference in our lives as disciples and Jesus followers. Today's law of the woods is, I think, the one that was our very first law of the woods when we coined the term, and that is everything's better with dirt. And really that saying came from food. I think it probably originated when I was very young and going on these trips with my dad and trying to balance a tin camping plate on my kneecaps while sitting on a stump or on a log and having my dinner fall off onto the ground as it slipped off my lap, and him telling me to just pick it up, put it back on the plate, and eat it, it won't hurt me. Everything's better with a little dirt. Now, dirt is one of those things that we have tried really hard in our lives to avoid. It's pretty removed in a lot of ways from our regular daily lives. We try to keep it off of from being under our fingernails. We get it on our clothes. We immediately wash them before we wear them again. We don't necessarily grow our own food anymore, and we have created a great system which we distance ourselves from being dirty as much as possible. And I think we all have become experts in hand washing over the past 14 months or so, where now with a surgeon's kind of diligence, we wash our hands and probably do it more times a day than ever before. So we are a dirt-free culture in a lot of ways. And in fact, the people who do spend some time with dirt are the people who have made a conscious choice that said, this is important to me. And I guess I'd like to think that I'm one of those people. I love to do yard work. I love to be in the garden. I love to plant things. I love to care for things. I love to get my hands dirty. Yes, I like to clean up afterwards, but there's something to me that's very soothing about that. Many of you have jobs like mine where you spend most of the day in your head. And then when you get to come home and in your off time you get to do something with your hands, that feels good. It's a different kind of thing. It's engaging a different part of our brain. It's using all of our bodies again. It's getting to be outdoors. And so I guess I like to play in the dirt. So everything is better with dirt. In fact, there's a lot of scientific evidence that shows that actually having our hands in soil is good for us, psychologically good for us. There have been numerous studies that cite really powerful examples of how people have been able to diminish anxiety or actually confront sometimes low-grade depression by engaging in outside activities where they get their hands dirty, where they actually put their hands in the dirt. And those of you who do this, you know what I'm talking about. You may not even have been able to name exactly what it is, but you find it satisfying. You find it fulfilling. You find it even restful to do this manual labor. And I put myself in that category, and yet it is something that is very far from us. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about dirt. And so as I was thinking about where does dirt come up in the Bible, there's quite a few examples. Because people in biblical times are living in very agrarian societies, right? I mean, this is a part of normal daily life for people. They are not as concerned with hygiene and clean clothes and not touching the ground as we are. In fact, things like wearing robes and sandals and wiping the dirt off your feet at the end of the day, foot washing, things like that. Jesus spits in the mud in one story and puts the muddy mix on a blind man's eyes and gives him sight again. But today's story, we're going to read from Mark. And it's the first parable that Jesus told his followers. So listen to this. It has a lot to do with dirt. From Mark chapter 4, I'll be starting with verse 1 and reading through 9. Again, Jesus began to teach beside the sea. Now, such a very large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat on the sea and sat there, while the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. He began to teach them many things in parables. And in his teaching, he said to them, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seed fell on the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Other seed fell on the rocky ground, where it did not have much soil, and it sprang up quickly, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. Other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it, and it yielded no grain. Other seed fell onto good soil, and brought forth grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30 and 60 and 100-fold. And he said, let anyone with ears to hear listen." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So this passage, there's parts of it that are confusing. I mean, like a lot of Jesus' parables, there's part of it that's just a little bit of a hidden meaning. And we may think that we understand it, but there's usually a lot more underneath the surface. And so this story is about this person who goes out sowing seeds and puts them on some pretty questionable places. Now, you may have heard this before, but in Jesus' time, people would grow crops a little bit differently than we do today. Right now, we spend a lot of time trying to make the soil as optimal as possible so that the seeds get planted there and the growth takes place and things, there's a yield. But in Jesus' time, the practice was pretty standard that you'd scatter the seeds and then you'd take a plow and you'd plow through all of that, cutting through the rocks, cutting through the thorny briar, whatever it was. And in doing so, it sort of folded over the soil on top of the seeds that you had previously scattered. So there isn't necessarily anything that's really unusual about that part of the story. And so it leads us to wonder, okay, so what is this parable about? So Jesus explains to his disciples in the following verses. He said, "No, this is the way I'm going to teach you today. It's through a parable. And so there's a lesson in this, and I want you to listen closely. I told you about the different kinds of seeds that fell, or the seeds that fell in different types of ground. He said, when I told you that some fell on the hardened pathway and the compacted soil from people who had spent years walking over the same turf, said that got eaten up by the birds. And what I'm talking about there is that sometimes the good news falls on people and they're kind of hardened. And Jesus says, and then it's like the birds are like Satan who come and pluck the seeds away. He said, then I told you about the rocky soil, and other people have like rocks in their life which don't allow the seeds to get down deep into the dirt. And so these people hear the good news and it springs up life immediately, but it doesn't really have staying power. There's nothing sustainable because deep roots never get established. So he says drought comes and circumstances in our life might dry up the spiritual moment that we had, and the seed ends up dying because it just withers. Then there's the thorny part. And he said, those are like people who have so much going on and they're pursuing power or they're pursuing wealth, and these other things just sort of strangle out the opportunity to really receive and internalize the good news. And so it's a fleeting thing. Well-intentioned, yes, but our priorities are misaligned, misplaced. And then he says, and lastly, there's the seeds that fall onto the optimal soil, the good stuff, the stuff that's ready to receive the seed. And that is where things flourish. And then he kind of gives an over-the-top example. It's almost hyperbole. He says it like yields 30 and then 60 and then 100-fold. 60, by the way, if somebody's own garden would yield 60-fold. One of the things that I read recently said that would be like enough to feed an entire village for the season. So Jesus is saying the root or the seed that takes root in that kind of soil, the sky's the limit. Like there are no limits on how much impact that could have. So that's what he's telling his disciples. So be thinking about that. And so naturally we start to think about, okay, so what kind of soil am I? What kind of soil are you? Now, we're sitting here in church on a Sunday morning, and so we probably think, I'd like to think of myself as the fourth type, the good type of soil. But when we do a little more introspective work, we could probably point to times that we were one of the other types. Or maybe, I guess I've arrived at the conclusion that I think I'm probably all four, sometimes within the same week, maybe even within the same day. I don't know that I am optimal soil all the time. I'd like to think that that's my best place of being, that's the place where I am most often, but that's probably not true. We all struggle with being the compacted, the rocky, the thorny, and sometimes the good soil. So I was reading this parable, thinking about this, and I came across this story in a biblical commentary this week that I'd like to share with you. It's from the president of a seminary, and he's a scholar in his own right, of course. His name is Tim Wardlaw, and he teaches at Austin Theological Seminary, where he's the president. And he was talking about an experience that he had that came to mind as he was contemplating this particular parable of Jesus. And it, I believe, offers some new insight. And I'm going to just read it verbatim as he wrote it because I love the way that he tells this story. So enter into this story with me. He talks about entering these hard-packed, thorny, and rocky places in life. And he says, I once caught a glimpse of God and God's mercy in just such a place. I was with a group of civic leaders, lawyers, politicians, foundation representatives, journalists. We were all touring various outposts of our city's criminal justice system. It was near the end of the day, and we were visiting the juvenile court and detention center. That place was so depressing. Its landscape marked by high wire meshes or mesh gates with large padlocks and razor wire wrapped around electrified fences. When the doors clanged shut behind us, I imagined how final they must have always sounded when adolescents and children were escorted there. We were led floor by floor through this facility by an amazing young judge who worked there. She showed us the holding cells where the new inmates are processed. She showed us the classrooms where an ongoing education is at least attempted. She showed us the courtrooms where the cases were prosecuted. Near the end of the tour, she led us down one bleak hallway to give us a sense of the cells where the young offenders lived. Each cell had a steel door with narrow slots about 2/3 of the way up, through which various pairs of eyes were watching us as we walked down the hall. Some of these children were accused of major crimes. Some were repeat offenders. Most of them, we learned, had little or no nurture across their brief lives. Not from a primary adult who cared about them, not from family, not from neighborhood, not from church. It was hard to notice those eyes staring through those narrow slots without doing something. So I lingered at one door and I whispered to one pair of eyes, "God loves you." The eyes did not appear to register much. And sometimes I wonder what, if anything, happened next. Did that news fall on a path and get eaten by birds? Did it fall among thorns to get choked out? I will never know. As the tour went on, the cumulative effect of all this brokenness got to one member of the group, who finally just stopped in the hallway and began to cry. When the judge noticed this, she paused her narration, walked back, and put her arms around that person, and with tears in her own eyes, said, "I know. I understand." I thought to myself in that moment, if I am ever judged, I want to judge like that. And then it dawned on me, like a seed thrown on my own path, that indeed I do have a judge like that. The thing about this particular parable that this story reminds us is that there's a part of this parable that has to do with the soil types. The compact, the rocky, the thorny, the optimal ground. But that's to miss the bigger part of the parable, which is that this parable tells us about the nature of the sower. If we read the parable and we think to ourselves, how ridiculous that somebody would waste all of that seed, casting it on thorny ground, on compact ground, on rocky soil, how wasteful, how ridiculous, how reckless. That's exactly the point. Our sower loves so much, is filled with so much grace, that's exactly the nature of God. To sow with reckless abandon, to show with extravagant generosity, to show with craziness that the world looks upon and says, that's outrageous. And our sower says, and I'm going to sow there in spite of what everybody else thinks. I am going to sow in the thorny places. I am going to go into the deepest, darkest places. I am going to go into the dangerous places and the forgotten places, the thorny, the compact, the rocky. I will sow there because I will have an impact there. I want my good news to be received and felt there. And maybe, just like the person belonging to those eyes peering through that cell door, just maybe that message gets through. Just maybe in this moment, one seed falls on soil that is ready to hear it and receive it. The progression of this parable is for us to begin with saying, oh my gosh, what kind of soil am I? I hope I'm the good kind. And if I'm not the good kind, how can I amend that soil to become the good kind? And then we move on from there that says, okay, once I have the good soil and the seed takes root and it grows, and then we can yield more seeds from it. We receive those seeds, and then guess what? It's our job to become the next sower. This is the progress of a Christian discipled life. We begin as the soil, we receive the seeds of the good news, we let that grow within us, it shapes us, it transforms us, then we take that and we pass it on. We become laborers in the vineyard, to borrow from another parable. We become co-sowers with God who first sowed that way for us. And then we take it and we sow as recklessly as God did with us. And we don't just go around picking and choosing the best types of places. We go wherever we go, and we scatter seed there. We share the good news at home, at school, in the workplace, in our neighborhood, in a different neighborhood, in this country and in others. We sow because that's what we do. We sow because that's what God does. A few weeks ago, we talked about a passage in one of the epistles where Paul was talking to a community of believers who said, some of us are baptized by Apollos and some of us are baptized by Paul. And so you're either in the Apollo group or in the Paul group. And Paul says, no, it's like I'm the seed and Apollos was the water, and all of that worked together because God is the one that does the growing. So if we take Paul's words and apply them to this parable, then we sow recklessly and God does something powerful then. God takes over. God does it from here. It's Father's Day today, as you know. And it occurs to me that one of the greatest responsibilities that we men who are fathers have is being sowers and being gardeners in the places that we have influence. With our children, with our grandchildren, with the people that we mentor, with the people within our sphere of influence. We bear that responsibility. Moms, obviously, you got that too. And we take it to the next step and say, it's not just about us, it's about Christendom. All Christians bear this responsibility. We are all called to be sowers. We are called to hear this story and think about how we are cultivating our own soil, and then how we are helping to nurture the soil of other people so that when we help sow the seeds of good news, something powerful takes root. Lives are changed. A difference is made in the world. Life grows out of death. A new chapter is written. This is our awesome privilege and responsibility. Everything tastes better with dirt. We figured that out early on our camping trips. To this date, I think the best steak I ever ate was after a long day of fishing and paddling, after I dropped it in the dirt, put it back on the plate, and I took a bite. Oreo cookies never taste better than after completing a long portage, carrying all your gear and getting to the other side. And before you put the boat back in the lake, you sit down and you take a look, you breathe deeply of the air, and you taste the most divine cookie you've ever had. Instant Folgers taste like the nectar of the gods at dawn when you sit there on the lake shore and you watch the loons and the mergansers dive for their morning breakfast. You watch the sunrise and you take that first sip of instant coffee. There's something special about clearing away all of the clutter. Leaving the email and the laptop and the phone behind where there is no signal. The distractions of difficulty in relationships or the hardships that we experience at home, work, or the office or school. And we just have that moment. And we appreciate nature for what it is, for the glory of what God has given us as a gift to be stewards of, to taste things in a way that we haven't tasted them before because we took them for granted. It's like the optimal soil time for us in our lives. And I don't know if you connect with nature like that, but it's a powerful thing. And in this parable, Jesus is talking about doing away with all the distractions, the hardened hearts that we have, to allow them to be soft. The thorny things, let them be cut away so they're not there trying to strangle and choke out the things that are most important in our lives, and to have our priorities straight. The rocky soil needs to be cleared away so that the things that we have that we experience as spiritually meaningful are not short-lived, but things that sustain us for the rest of our lives. We have to clear away all of those things so that we can be the optimal soil. And when something grows within us, we then harvest those seeds, scatter them, and share them for others to experience the same. Whether you sit here today more feeling like soil in need of being amended, or whether ready to sow seeds because you feel called to do that, we are all in this process somewhere, which is the beauty and the power of this parable. Everything's better with dirt. Maybe it needs the seed at the right time. Maybe it's dirt that needs to be amended. We are all a work in progress, but we are all working to grow and create the kind of kingdom, the kind of garden that Jesus describes.